The town of Red Hollow lay beneath the weight of silence, the kind that clung to a place long after the last gunshot had faded into the hills. Wind swept through the dirt street, lifting pale dust into the air and dragging it across wooden porches and the legs of hitching posts like a slow, tired sigh. Windows were shuttered against the sun, and even the saloon doors barely stirred. Life still existed here, but it moved cautiously now, as if afraid to wake something that had gone to sleep in sorrow. At the far edge of town, where the houses thinned and the land opened into endless brown fields, stood a small homestead with a leaning fence and a porch that creaked even when no one walked across it. This was where Clara Hale lived now, alone except for the ghosts of memory and the weight of a name that still followed her everywhere she went. Widow. The word had settled into her bones like cold, refusing to leave. Her husband had been buried beneath the cottonwood tree beyond the creek nearly a year ago, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross she had carved herself because she had no money for stone. Each morning she carried water from the well, fed the horses he had once cared for, and spoke to no one unless she absolutely had to. Her grief had become a quiet routine, stitched into every movement she made. She no longer cried the way she had in the beginning. The tears had dried into something heavier, something that pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe. The townsfolk watched her from a distance, whispering behind hands and glancing away when she met their eyes. They said a widow should be left alone, that sorrow was contagious, that grief drew bad luck to those who lingered too long beside it. Clara accepted this distance because it was easier than fighting it. It was easier than explaining that she did not know how to be anything other than what tragedy had made her. On the afternoon the stranger rode into Red Hollow. She was standing at the fence, staring out at the flat horizon where the sky melted into land, thinking of nothing at all. The man appeared first as a shape against the heat haze, tall in the saddle, moving slow and deliberate, as if he carried the weight of many miles on his back. His horse was dust-covered and tired, its head low, its breath heavy. Clara watched him approach with a kind of numb curiosity. Strangers came through Red Hollow sometimes, usually passing through on their way to somewhere better, somewhere alive. They rarely stayed. This man looked no different at first glance. Wide, brimmed hat pulled low, dark coat worn thin at the edges, boots scarred by time and travel. But there was something in the way he rode, something careful and restrained, that made Clara feel as though the air around her had shifted. He slowed as he neared her fence, lifting his gaze just enough for her to see his eyes beneath the shadow of his hat. They were a deep, unsettled blue, the color of a storm threatening rain but never quite delivering it. He did not speak at first. He only watched her as if measuring something invisible between them. Clara straightened instinctively, her fingers tightening around the rough wood of the fence rail. Strangers made her uneasy now. Everyone did. "You lost?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. The man shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel smoothed by water. "Just passing through. Needed water for the horse." She hesitated, then nodded toward the well. "Help yourself," she said, already turning away. She did not intend to stay and watch him, but something in the stillness between them made her pause. As he dismounted, she noticed the careful way he moved, as though pain lived in his joints, as though every step carried a memory of injury. He led his horse to the well, drawing water slowly, giving the animal time to drink. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, annoyed at herself for caring at all. When he finished, he rested a hand against the well's stone rim and exhaled, the sound heavy with something more than physical exhaustion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind filled the space between them, tugging at Clara's dress, rattling the loose boards of the porch. Then, unexpectedly, the man turned his face slightly toward her and spoke in a voice so quiet it felt like a secret. "I'm sorry for your loss." The words hit her like a sudden gust of cold air. Clara froze. She had not told him. He could not have known. "What?" she said sharply, her heart thudding against her ribs. He did not meet her eyes. His gaze stayed on the ground, on the dust that swirled around his boots. "Your fence," he said softly. "The way it leans, the way the place feels, I've seen it before. Homes don't grow that quiet unless someone's been buried nearby." The simplicity of his observation unsettled her more than any pity ever had. Most people spoke to her with careful softness, afraid to break her further. This man spoke as if he recognized something in her silence, because he carried the same kind of quiet within himself. Clara felt a strange ache in her chest, something sharp and unfamiliar. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice defensive despite herself. "No," he agreed, "but I know what it's like to lose someone and keep breathing anyway." For reasons she did not understand, those words broke something open inside her. Not in a flood of tears, but in a thin crack, like ice giving way beneath careful feet. She turned fully toward him now, studying his face, the lines carved by sun and time, the faint scar that cut across his jaw. "You should go," she said, but the words lacked force. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, as if he understood the boundary she was trying to hold. "I will," he said. Then, as if unable to stop himself, he added in a whisper meant only for her, "Sometimes the quiet is worse than the pain. Don't let it swallow you whole." The whisper lingered in the air after he mounted his horse and rode toward the town road, leaving behind nothing but dust and a tremor in Clara's chest that refused to fade. Clara did not watch the cowboy leave. She told herself it was because she had work to do, because the fence needed fixing, and the horses needed feeding, and the day was already slipping away from her. But when the sound of hooves faded into the distance, she stood very still beside the well, her hand resting on the cold stone, her breath shallow as if the air itself had grown heavier. The stranger's whisper clung to her thoughts like burrs caught in fabric. Sometimes the quiet is worse than the pain. The words stirred something restless inside her, something she had learned to keep buried. She turned away at last, forcing her body back into the rhythm of chores, but her mind refused to follow. As she fed the horses, she remembered the way her husband's hands had once moved over the same bridles, steady and sure, his voice humming old tunes he claimed he barely remembered. She had loved the sound of his humming, because it meant the day was ordinary, that nothing terrible was happening. Ordinary days had become rare after the men who rode under no flag came through Red Hollow, looking for trouble and finding it in the smallest disagreements. Her husband had stood between them and a frightened shopkeeper, not because he thought himself brave, but because he had never known how to stand aside when cruelty appeared in front of him. The gunshot had echoed once, sharp and final, and the town had gone quiet in the way only a place that has witnessed sudden death ever does. Clara had not screamed then. She had not cried until much later, when the ground had already swallowed him and the cottonwood tree had cast its long shadow over the fresh mound of earth. She worked until her hands ached, until the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised colors of orange and purple. The homestead grew darker with each passing moment, the shadows stretching across the yard like fingers reaching for her ankles. She lit the lantern inside, the small circle of light barely holding back the encroaching night. The quiet settled around her again, thick and suffocating. The stranger's words returned unbidden, as if he had spoken them into a place inside her that had been waiting to hear them. She told herself it meant nothing. He was passing through. He was no one. And yet, when a knock sounded on her door after dark, her heart leapt with a fear that felt too sharp to be ordinary. She hesitated, the lantern trembling slightly in her hand as she moved toward the door. No one came to her home after sundown. People in Red Hollow avoided widows at night, as if sorrow might slip from the shadows and cling to them. She opened the door just enough to peer out, her breath catching when she recognized the silhouette of the same man, hat in hand now, his posture oddly uncertain. "I'm sorry to trouble you," he said quietly. "The saloon's full and the livery won't take in my horse. They said you might have space." Clara stared at him, torn between the instinct to shut the door and the strange pull she had felt since the afternoon. She had no reason to help him. She had every reason not to invite a stranger into her space, into the fragile order she had built around her grief. But the night pressed in close behind him, and something in his expression reminded her of herself on the loneliest evenings, standing at the edge of her porch and wishing the darkness would not swallow her whole. "There's room in the barn," she said finally, her voice barely louder than the creak of the door. "You can stay with your horse, just for the night." Relief flickered across his face, brief and unguarded. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that felt deeper than courtesy. She watched from the doorway as he led his horse toward the barn, the lantern light catching the dust in the air and turning it into a haze of gold. When he returned, he stopped a careful distance from her, as if aware of the invisible line she was drawing between them. "Name's Elias," he said. Elias Boone. The sound of his name settled into her chest with an unexpected weight. "Clara," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "Hale." She did not know why she gave him her husband's name instead of her own maiden name, why it felt important that he know who she had been tethered to. Elias nodded, his eyes softening with understanding. "I won't be any trouble," he said. "I'll be gone at first light." She nodded, already stepping back. The door closed between them with a quiet finality, but the night did not feel as empty as it had before. She lay awake long after the lantern was extinguished, listening to the distant sounds of the barn, to the soft shift of hooves and the low murmur of a man speaking to his horse in tones meant to soothe. For the first time in a year, the quiet did not feel like an enemy pressing in from all sides. It felt different, not kinder, not safe, but changed in some small, unexplainable way. Morning came slow and pale, the light creeping over the hills as if unsure of its welcome. Clara rose before the sun fully cleared the horizon, her body still moving to the rhythm of habit. She told herself she would see Elias gone, that the barn would be empty and the strange disturbance in her thoughts would fade with him. But when she stepped outside, she found him already awake, sitting on the barn's low step with a tin cup in his hands, steam curling up from the dark liquid inside. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, surprise flickering across his features. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. "Was just gathering myself." She nodded, unsure what to say, and busied herself at the well, drawing water and pretending her pulse was not quickening with every glance in his direction. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that might never come. "You don't have to leave right this minute," she said without looking at him, the words escaping her before she had decided to speak them. Silence stretched between them. Then Elias stood, setting the cup aside. "I don't want to be where I'm not wanted," he said carefully. Clara finally met his eyes. "That's not what I meant," she said. "It's just the road's long. There's no harm in resting another hour." He studied her, as if weighing the truth of her words against the warning in her posture. At last, he inclined his head. "Thank you," he said again, quieter this time. They moved through the morning in parallel silence, tending to small tasks without speaking, sharing the space without touching it. The sun rose higher, warming the yard, softening the edges of the shadows that had felt so sharp the night before. Clara found herself aware of Elias's presence in a way that unsettled her, of the careful way he handled her tools, of the way he paused to let her pass, of the weight of his gaze when he thought she was not looking. "You're running from something," she said suddenly, the observation surprising even herself. Elias stilled, his hand tightening around the fence rail. "What makes you think that?" he asked. She shrugged, the motion small and defensive. "People who aren't running don't carry that kind of tired in their bones." A sad smile touched his mouth. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "There are men who'd like to see me dead. I've been keeping ahead of them." The truth of it settled over her with a chill. "Then you shouldn't stay," she said. "If you bring danger here—" "I won't," he interrupted gently. "I swear it. I'd rather keep moving than let trouble touch you." The protectiveness in his voice startled her. No one had spoken to her that way since her husband's death. It felt both comforting and terrifying. The unspoken thing between them grew heavier, thick with possibilities she did not dare name. When Elias finally prepared to leave, saddling his horse with deliberate slowness, Clara stood at the edge of the yard, her hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. "You'll forget this place," she said, the words more a command to herself than to him. "Maybe," he said, his eyes holding hers. "But I don't think I'll forget you." He mounted his horse, the leather creaking beneath him, and for a moment it seemed as though he might say more, might cross the line she had drawn. Instead, he tipped his hat, a small, respectful gesture, and turned toward the road. As he rode away, Clara felt the quiet settle around her again, but this time, it did not close in quite as tightly as before. The whisper he had given her lingered, not as a wound, but as a spark, small and dangerous, glowing in the place where her grief had once ruled alone. The days that followed Elias Boone's departure were restless ones for Clara. Red Hollow returned to its usual rhythm of muted voices and cautious glances, but something in her had shifted, as if the ground beneath her careful routines had cracked just enough to let light seep through. She found herself standing at the fence more often, her gaze drawn to the road that cut through the fields like a pale scar, half expecting to see a familiar silhouette rise from the dust. The expectation embarrassed her. She scolded herself for it, for allowing a passing stranger to disturb the fragile balance she had built around her sorrow. Yet the memory of his presence lingered in small, persistent ways, in the echo of his quiet voice, in the way he had spoken to his horse with tenderness, in the strange comfort of being seen without being pitied. The town began to stir with rumor not long after. Men gathered in low clusters near the saloon, their voices hushed but urgent, their eyes scanning the road with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Clara overheard fragments as she passed, talk of a bounty hunter searching for a man accused of killing a powerful rancher's son, of blood spilled on a distant trail, of justice bought and sold for the right price. She felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. When she heard the name Elias Boone spoken in those same hushed tones, the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. They said he was dangerous. They said he carried death behind him like a shadow that stretched farther with every mile. Clara told herself it could not be the same man. The Elias she had met had spoken softly, had treated her with a care she had not known in a year. But doubt gnawed at her, relentless. That night the wind carried the distant thunder of hooves, and Clara's heart leapt with a fear that felt too sharp to be hope. The night Elias Boone returned to Red Hollow, he did not ride in like a man who believed he would be welcomed by the morning. The moon hung low and bruised in the sky, its pale light stretching across the dirt road like a warning. Clara was awake, though she had not planned to be. The wind had been restless, tapping against the window, stirring old fears that refused to stay buried. When the distant sound of hooves reached her, her breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was only the wind playing tricks on her ears, only another traveler passing through. But the rhythm of the steps was too deliberate, too careful. She lit the lantern with trembling fingers and stepped onto the porch. The figure that emerged from the darkness swayed in the saddle, his posture slumped, his movements unsteady. Clara recognized him before the lantern light fully found his face. Elias slid from his horse and nearly fell to his knees. She rushed forward without thinking, the year of careful isolation shattering in an instant. "Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking the night's fragile stillness. He looked up at her, his eyes unfocused, pain etched into every line of his face. "Didn't mean to come back," he murmured. "But I couldn't keep going." Blood darkened his shirt beneath his coat, seeping through the fabric in slow, terrible blossoms. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she guided him toward the house, her small frame straining under his weight. She did not stop to think of the danger he might bring with him, of the rumors that had begun to curl through Red Hollow like smoke. All she knew was that he was hurt, and that the quiet she had lived in for a year had taught her too much about what it meant to let someone suffer alone. Inside, she laid him on the narrow bed that still carried the faint shape of another man's absence. The sight of Elias there, bleeding and vulnerable, stirred a tangle of emotions she could not name: fear, pity, something dangerously close to longing. She pressed clean cloth to his wound, her hand steady despite the storm in her chest. "They're close," he said through clenched teeth. "3 men, bounty hunters. They think I killed a rancher's boy." Clara's jaw tightened. "Did you?" she asked, the question heavy with everything it might cost her to hear the answer. Elias shook his head weakly. "No, I tried to stop him from hurting a woman. He drew first." The truth of his words rang in his voice, raw and unpolished. Clara believed him in a way that frightened her. "You can't stay," she said, though she did not move away. "If they come here." "I know," he whispered. "I'll leave before dawn. I just need a little time." She nodded, even as dread coiled in her stomach. Outside, the night pressed in close, and the road that cut through Red Hollow seemed to pulse with unseen movement, as if the danger Elias carried had found the scent of him at last. Clara worked through the night, tending Elias's wound with a focus that left no room for fear until her hands were slick with blood, and the cloths were stained beyond saving. The intimacy of the task unsettled her, the way his breath shuddered beneath her touch, the way his fingers twitched, as if reaching for something he did not dare claim. When his breathing finally evened into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep, she sank into the chair beside the bed, her strength leaving her all at once. The house felt too small, the walls too thin to keep out the world that hunted him. She did not sleep. She listened to every creak of wood, every whisper of wind, every distant sound that might be hooves on the road. When dawn began to lighten the edges of the sky, a shout shattered the fragile quiet. Clara's heart lurched as voices rose outside, rough, confident, certain of their purpose. "We know you're here, Boone," a man called, his tone carrying the cruel assurance of someone who believed the world owed him obedience. Elias stirred, pain flashing across his face as he tried to sit up. "I'll go," he said hoarsely. "I won't let them hurt you." Clara's fear flared into something fierce and reckless. "You can barely stand," she hissed. "If you step outside like this, they'll kill you." The voices grew closer, boots crunching on gravel, the men's shadows stretching long across the yard. Clara's mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to hide, to return to the quiet safety of her grief. But safety had already been taken from her once, ripped from her hands without mercy. She would not surrender it again without a fight. "There's a cellar," she said quickly, "under the floor. It's hidden. They won't find you if you stay quiet." Elias hesitated, conflict warring with desperation in his eyes. "They'll tear this place apart," he said. "You don't deserve that." Clara's voice shook with a strength she did not know she possessed. I deserve to choose, she said. The words felt like a declaration, a reclaiming of something she had lost when her husband died. Elias nodded, the moment heavy with unspoken gratitude and something far more dangerous. She helped him into the cellar just as a fist pounded against the door, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Clara straightened, smoothing her dress with trembling hands before opening the door. 3 men stood on her porch, their expressions hard, their eyes sharp with intent. "We're looking for a man," the tallest said, his gaze sweeping over her with a casual disregard that made her skin crawl. "Elias Boone. He passed through here." Clara met his stare, her grief, worn composure hardening into something unyielding. "Lots of men pass through Red Hollow," she said. "You won't find trouble here." The men exchanged glances, doubt flickering briefly before suspicion took its place. They stepped closer, the weight of their presence pressing against her fragile barrier of calm. Inside the house, beneath the floor, Elias held his breath, listening to the woman he had barely known risk everything to shield him. Outside, the horizon darkened with the promise of violence, and the quiet of Red Hollow stood on the brink of being shattered forever. The men did not believe Clara, not fully. They never did trust women who stood alone, who spoke with quiet certainty instead of fear. They pushed past her into the house, their boots tracking dust across the worn floorboards, their eyes scanning every shadow for signs of the man they hunted. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain they could hear it, could feel it vibrating through the thin walls. She stood rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, her gaze fixed on the smallest of their movements. The tallest man knelt, pressing his palm to the floor as if feeling for hollow spaces beneath the boards. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. Clara thought of her husband's grave beneath the cottonwood tree, of the vow she had made to herself that she would never again stand by while violence took someone from her without resistance. The whisper Elias had given her on the first day they met echoed in her mind, a reminder that silence could be its own kind of death. When the man's fingers brushed the seam of the hidden cellar door, Clara spoke, her voice ringing through the room with a force that startled even her. "There's nothing here for you," she said, "and you're not welcome to tear apart what little I have left." The men turned toward her, surprise giving way to irritation. The smallest of them laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "You think you can stop us," he sneered. Clara did not know where the courage came from, only that it rose up from the same place her grief lived, fierce and unyielding. "I think you already know you're wrong," she said. Outside, a horse whinnied, restless, as if sensing the tension coiled within the house. The tall man straightened slowly, studying her with narrowed eyes. "If you're lying," he said, "we'll be back." The threat hung in the air long after they turned and left, their footsteps fading into the dust. Clara sagged against the wall, her legs trembling beneath her. Beneath the floor, Elias let out the breath he had been holding, the sound soft and broken with relief and something dangerously close to awe. The house did not feel real after the men left. The air seemed thinner, as if fear had burned the oxygen from it. Clara slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her hands pressed against her ribs as if holding her heart in place. It took several long moments before she found the strength to lift the loose board and whisper Elias's name. He emerged slowly from the cellar, his face pale, his jaw clenched against pain. When he stood, unsteady on his feet, Clara rose with him, their eyes meeting in the fragile quiet that followed danger. The space between them felt charged, alive with everything they had not said. "You should have let me go," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "They would have taken me and left you be." Clara shook her head, her eyes bright with unshaded tears she refused to let fall. "That's not how men like that leave anything," she said. "They take what they want and break what they can't." The truth of her words settled between them like a weight. Elias reached out, then stopped himself, his hand hovering in the space between them. "You don't know what you've risked," he murmured. Clara laughed softly, the sound brittle with old pain. "I know exactly what risk feels like," she said. "I buried it a year ago beneath a cottonwood tree." The mention of her husband's grave felt like an admission of something raw and sacred. Elias's eyes softened with understanding and a restraint that spoke of respect, not distance. "I never meant to pull you into this," he said. "I should leave before they change their minds." The thought of him leaving twisted something deep in Clara's chest. She had survived a year of emptiness by convincing herself that solitude was safety. Now, faced with the choice to return to that quiet, she realized how thin and fragile that belief had always been. "If you go now you won't make it far," she said. "You can barely sit a saddle." Elias exhaled slowly, the fight draining from his shoulders. "Then I'll rest until I can," he said. And when I leave, I won't look back." The words sounded like a promise meant to protect them both. The hours that followed passed in a strange, suspended calm. Clara tended his wound again, her hands gentler now, her movements slower, more deliberate. Each touch felt like a question neither of them dared to ask aloud. The world beyond the walls of her home waited, heavy with threat, but inside, the quiet had transformed into something fragile and human. When Elias slept, his breath steady but shallow, Clara sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, feeling the dangerous pull of something she had sworn she would never allow herself again. She wondered if love was always born this way, in the shadow of fear, in the fragile space between loss and hope. The bounty hunters returned at dusk, their patience exhausted, their suspicion sharpened by the absence of proof. Clara heard them before she saw them, the sound of hooves grinding against gravel, the murmur of voices thick with intent. Elias stirred, his eyes flying open, pain and resolve flickering across his face. "This ends tonight," he whispered. Clara's heart thundered in her ears as she helped him to his feet. "No," she said fiercely. "You can't face them like this." "I can't keep hiding behind you," he replied. The truth of his words struck her with the force of a blow. She had offered him shelter, not because she believed she could protect him, but because she could not bear the thought of standing aside while someone she cared for was hunted. The realization of that care left her breathless. Outside, the men called his name again, their voices mocking, certain of victory. Clara made her choice in a heartbeat. She stepped onto the porch before Elias could stop her, the lantern in her hand casting trembling light across the yard. "You're not taking him," she said, her voice carrying into the dark. The men laughed, the sound cruel and disbelieving. The tallest of them reached for his gun. In that instant, Elias moved. He stepped out behind her, his hand raised, his posture careful and unthreatening. "I'll come with you," he said. "But you leave her out of it." Clara turned on him, her eyes blazing with fear and something dangerously close to love. "You don't owe them your life," she said. Elias met her gaze, the unspoken confession in his eyes more powerful than any words.
"I owe you yours," he replied.
The standoff shattered in a blur of motion. A shot rang out, splitting the night, and chaos erupted. Dust flew, horses reared, voices shouted. Clara dropped to the ground as Elias lunged forward, pain twisting his face as he took the brunt of the moment meant for her. When the noise finally faded, one of the bounty hunters lay wounded, the others retreating in a flurry of curses and threats they could no longer carry out. The yard fell into a stunned silence broken only by Clara's sobs as she crawled to Elias's side. He lay on the ground, blood darkening the dirt beneath him, his breath ragged but alive. She pressed her hands against the wound, tears spilling freely now, her restraint finally shattered. "You don't get to die," she whispered fiercely. "You don't get to leave me with another grave." Elias's lips curved in the faintest, most fragile smile. "Wes, I don't have much choice then," he murmured. Dawn came with a quiet that felt earned, the sky pale and new above the scarred yard. Elias survived, the bounty hunters driven off by the sudden presence of townsfolk drawn by the sound of gunfire. Red Hollow did not return to its old silence after that night. People spoke to Clara differently now, with a respect born of witnessing her stand between danger and the man she loved. Weeks later, when Elias was strong enough to ride, he did not leave at dawn. He stayed. The whisper he had given her in the dust had changed everything, not because it promised her safety, but because it reminded her she was still alive, still capable of choosing love in a world that had tried to teach her only loss.